At first he was silent because he didn't know what to say. Then he was silent because no one was asking anymore. He hadn't planned to be silent. It wasn't a decision, it wasn't an act of protest or escape. It was a pause. A brief, almost imperceptible pause. Like a breath before words that didn't come. The moment someone asked, "Are you okay?" He wanted to answer. He really wanted to. But something stopped him. Not fear. Not shame. Just emptiness. The words that had once been there now seemed distant. As if they belonged to someone else. As if he had forgotten what his own voice sounded like. And that pause. It remained. Not as silence. But as a space in which he had stopped searching. He began to notice that silence is not simply the absence of words. It is a state. Like water filling cracks. Like a shadow that lies on a wall and does not move. In the first days, he still tried to speak. He wrote messages, erased them. He opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at people, and thought, is it worth saying something if no one hears? Silence became comfortable. Not because he had nothing to say, but because every attempt to speak seemed like a struggle. Words are like stones that must be pulled from the depths. And the depths are dark, cold, unknown. He was not afraid of the darkness. He simply did not want to pull anymore. And so, one evening, he sat in the kitchen. The tea was getting cold, and the phone was silent. He looked out the window, and thought, perhaps I had become the silence that I had created. Not because someone forced me to. And because silence doesn't ask questions, doesn't wait for answers, doesn't disappoint. It was the first pause. Not as a stop, but as the beginning of a new way of being. He didn't know that this pause would become a habit, that it would sprout into every conversation, into every look, into every, "How are you?" to which he no longer answered. He hadn't planned to be silent, but silence planned him. This was the first chapter of silence. And she didn't scream. She simply remained. Like a shadow, like a pause, like a beginning. He learned to be silent in front of the mirror. Not because he had nothing to say, but because the mirror didn't ask. At first he just looked. At himself. At the eyes that were once alive. At the face that was once searching for something. Now, no. Now it just was. The mirror doesn't ask. It doesn't say, "How are you?" It doesn't ask, "What hurts?" It just shows. And he learned to be silent in front of it. It became a ritual. In the morning, washing, a look, silence. In the evening, a look, silence, sleep. Not a word. Not a thought. Just a habit. He stopped talking even in his mind. Because thoughts are also a voice. And a voice is also a responsibility. And responsibility is something he no longer wanted. In the mirror he saw himself. But he didn't recognize himself. Not because he had changed, but because he had stopped being the one who spoke. Silence had become a part of his body. Like a scar that no longer hurt, but was still there. Like a wrinkle that appeared not from age, but from the loss of words. He tried. Really tried. One day he said to himself, "Today I will say something. At least one word." He stood in front of the mirror. He opened his mouth. And nothing. The word did not come. As if it had gotten lost. As if it did not know how to sound in this silence. He smiled. Not out of joy, but out of understanding. Because silence is not just the absence of words. It is a state. It is a space in which he has learned to live. The mirror became his interlocutor. Without words. Without reactions. Without expectations. And it was convenient. Because no one expected an explanation. No one asked, "Why are you silent?" No one said, "Speak." He began to notice how silence penetrated other spheres. In conversations with friends, short answers. In messages, reactions without text. In thoughts, pauses instead of phrases. Silence became a language. Not as a choice, but as a habit. And this habit, it did not shout. It did not demand attention. It simply was. Like a shadow that is always nearby. Like a background against which colors are no longer visible. One day he caught himself thinking, I no longer know what my voice sounds like. And it did not scare him. It calmed him. Because if the voice is gone, then the expectations are gone. And without expectations, it is easier. He didn't stop being himself. He simply became himself, in silence. And the mirror, it hadn't changed. It still showed. But now he didn't see himself, but the silence he had learned to wear. This was the second chapter. The chapter in which silence became not a reaction, but a form of existence. No one asked why he was silent, because everyone was used to it, and he was even more so. The day began as usual. The alarm clock rang, but he was already awake. Not because he slept well, but because his thoughts wouldn't let him sleep. But even his thoughts didn't speak anymore. He got up, brushed his teeth, made coffee. His movements were automatic. His gaze was empty. No words. At work, hello, how are you? Is everything okay? He nodded. He smiled. Sometimes he even answered, nothing. But that wasn't an answer. It was a form. Like a form of clothing that you wear because you have to. No one asked any deeper questions, because everyone was used to it, and he was even more so. Silence became part of his social code. He knew when to smile, when to nod, when to say, yeah, or uh-huh. And it worked. People didn't notice, because silence is convenient. It doesn't create conflicts. It doesn't cause inconvenience. He walked down the street, listening to music without words. Because words are noise, and noise is what he no longer wanted. In the store, thank you, no package, have a nice day. Automatic phrases, as if he were a voice assistant, who answered without emotion. Sometimes he would stop. He looked at the people who were talking, laughing, shouting, explaining, and he thought, could I ever do that too? But the answer didn't come, because it was silent too. He started writing. Not a diary. Not letters. Just phrases. Separate. Without context. I'm hurting. I don't know how to speak. Silence is not peace. But even these phrases, he couldn't say, because paper is not a mirror, and a voice is not a pen. Days passed, like pages that no one reads. He lived, but he didn't make a sound. And it became the norm. Not a tragedy, not a drama, but simply a habit. People stopped asking, because he stopped answering. And when silence lasts a long time, it becomes part of the landscape. Nobody asks why the sky is gray. Nobody asks why the wind is silent. Nobody asks why he doesn't speak. And he stopped asking himself, because a question is also a form of voice. And a voice is what he lost. That was the third chapter. A chapter in which silence became not a reaction, but a part of the day. Like morning coffee. Like evening silence. Like a habit that no one notices. Sometimes silence is not peace. It is the fear of being heard. He didn't like to explain. Not because he couldn't, but because every explanation is a discovery. And a discovery is vulnerability. And vulnerability is a risk. He learned to be silent not out of indifference, but through experience. Because every time he tried to explain, he was not understood. Or understood incorrectly. Or understood but not accepted. And then he decided, maybe it's better not to explain. Maybe it's better to just be. Without words. Without arguments. Without defense. It was warm, not because it was good, but because it was familiar. Silence became a blanket. It enveloped him, protected him from questions, from eyes that wanted to know more, from voices waiting for an answer. He no longer wanted to be an answer, because an answer is a promise, and he no longer promised, In conversations, he learned to avoid depth. "How are you?" "I'm fine." "What's new?" "Nothing." "Why are you silent?" "I'm just thinking." But he didn't think. He hid. In silence. In habit. In the warmth that doesn't warm, but doesn't burn. Sometimes he imagined himself speaking. How he explained why he was silent. How he said, "I'm afraid they won't understand me. I'm afraid they'll judge me. I'm afraid that after my words, there will be an even deeper silence." But these images, they remained in his head, because a voice is an action, and an action is a step. And he didn't step anymore. He learned to live in pauses, between question and answer, between look and reaction, between himself and the world. And these pauses, they became his home. One day he heard someone say, "You are always so calm." And he smiled, because it was not calm. It was fear, wrapped in habit, covered in silence, signed as normal. He did not want to be a mystery, but silence made him one. And he did not object, because a mystery is not asked. It is simply accepted or ignored. And he learned to be accepted through silence, not through explanation. It was warm, not because it was good, but because it did not hurt. Sometimes he thought, what if I explained? What if I said everything I kept inside? What if I allowed myself to be heard? But these thoughts, they were like a fire in a fireplace that no one lights, because the warmth is already there. And though it is weak, it is familiar. This was chapter 4, the chapter in which silence became not an escape, but a form of comfort, a form of survival, a form of being without explanation. Silence is like fog. At first light, almost invisible, and then thick, sticky everywhere. At first he thought it was temporary. That silence was a reaction to fatigue, to disappointment, to pain, that it would pass like a cold, like a night terror, like rain that doesn't last forever. But it didn't pass. Silence settled. In the vocal cords, in the fingers that no longer wrote, in the eyes that no longer searched. It became fog. At first light, almost invisible, as if it were just the wrong day, as if it were just the wrong mood, and then thick, sticky, everywhere. He stopped hearing himself, not because he didn't want to, but because the voice is a muscle, and a muscle that doesn't move weakens, and a weak voice doesn't make a sound, and what doesn't make a sound disappears. He began to forget words, not complex ones, simple ones. I love. It hurts. I am. These words, they didn't come anymore, as if they had lost their way, as if they didn't know where he was. And he didn't look for them, because searching is action, and action is desire, and desire is hope. And he no longer hoped. Fog became part of his thinking. He thought in fragments, phrases without endings, beginnings without continuations. Maybe, if, but, and that was it. No conclusions, no decisions, only fog. He stopped writing, because every sentence seemed like a lie, not because it wasn't true, but because he didn't feel it. And if you don't feel it, then you can't say it. He looked at the old notes, at the words he once wrote, and he thought, who was it? Because it definitely wasn't him. The one who wrote had a voice, had pain, had the power to say it, and he had a fog. And this fog, it wasn't scary. It was familiar, like the smell of an old book, like the sound of a refrigerator at night, like a habit that you don't notice, but it's always there. He stopped fighting, because fighting is also a voice, and a voice is what he lost. Sometimes he heard others talking, loud, emotional, and it was like noise, as if someone was shouting in a temple, as if someone was breaking the silence that had already become sacred. He wasn't judging. He just didn't understand. Because when you live in a fog, light seems like aggression. This was the 5th chapter, the chapter in which silence became not just a habit, but a part of the body, a part of memory, a part of who he had become. One day someone asked, "Are you silent because you are comfortable? Are you afraid of being heard?" And it was like a blow, because he didn't know the answer. But for the first time, he wanted to find it. It was an ordinary day. Nothing foreshadowed change. He sat in his usual silence, like in an old chair, a little uncomfortable, but familiar. And then, the question. Simple, direct, unexpected. Are you silent because you are comfortable? Are you afraid of being heard? He didn't answer right away, because he didn't have a ready answer, because he had never asked himself such a question, because silence was the background, not the topic. But something in him shuddered, as if the silence had become loud for the first time. He went home, sat down in the darkness, and repeated the question, not out loud, inside, like a prayer, like a challenge, like a beginning. Am I comfortable? Yes. Because no one is waiting. No one is pressuring. No one is disappointed. Am I afraid? Yes. Because if I say, they might not understand. They might turn away. They might see the real me, and not accept me. But between these yes, there was something else. A desire. Subtle. Uncertain. But alive. A desire to be heard. Not appreciated. Not justified. Simply heard. He began to remember the first words he had ever said. The first confessions, the first pains, the first joys, and he understood. He had not always been silent. He had once spoken. He had spoken sincerely. He spoke deeply. He spoke because he believed he was being heard. And then something broke, and he fell silent. And silence became a habit, and habit a home. But now, the question became a crack, not a destruction, but an opportunity. He didn't speak right away. He didn't write a post. He didn't record a video. He didn't make a loud gesture. He simply, for the first time in a long time, said to himself, "I want to be heard." It wasn't a confession. It was a return. To himself. To a voice. To a desire. And the silence, for the first time in a long time, felt uncomfortable to him. But empty. This was the 6th chapter. The chapter in which the silence cracked. Not with a scream, but with a question, which became the first word.